I picked this title, I feel a little bit like Byron, because I picked this title, it's like I know exactly what I'm going to say, and then I started thinking about it, and it got more and more and more complicated. So here's my general disclaimer. I may, by the time we're done here in an hour, I may have posed more questions than I have provided answers, but I hope that at the end of that time you will understand that's probably okay, given where we collectively are when it comes to understanding evaluation in the context of the Includes program. As Pam mentioned, Kiesel Associates, we're in Syracuse, New York. We're a for-profit, 10-person research and evaluation firm. Not necessarily by plan, but sort of by need. We've ended up specializing in STEM education and workforce development programs. We've got, at one point we were like the biggest, if not second, maybe second biggest evaluator of Department of Labor Trade Adjustment Act, community college programs, job workforce retraining programs in the nation. As of yesterday, I counted, we have 13 National Science Foundations projects that we are either a research partner or an external evaluator on. And I'm very lucky that I have 10 very smart people that I get to work with. Framing this conversation about teaching and learning and evaluating innovations in teaching and learning at multiple scales, there's a lot of different ways that it could go, a lot of different things that we could talk about. So what I've tried to do here is sort of hem myself in a little bit. We're going to talk about some general challenges of multi-level, multi-site evaluation. We're going to talk about some opportunities that I think are afforded by taking a research and development or R&D kind of view and orientation on this work. We're going to talk about the implications of that vis-a-vis studying innovations versus studying programs, and that's a distinction that I think might become useful to you all as you look forward to these endeavors. And then I'm going to try and bring it back and talk about some specific implications for the Includes program. I do want to leave time at the end for question and answers. I'm pretty confident. They've been really generous with time, so I think an hour will do us all really a lot of good. So let's start with sort of a general overview of challenges of multi-level, multi-site evaluation. The interesting thing is, as I went to, because I have some ideas about this from 14, 15 years as a practitioner in evaluation and as an educator prior to that, I had some ideas about this, but I decided to look and see what the literature says. And it's interesting because the literature tends to focus on the implications of multi-level and multi-site evaluation on inferential statistical analyses. So how do you model this stuff when you've got outcome measures for a bunch of sites that may or may not be nested? And I got bored with that really fast, frankly, because I'm not sure that that's where we're at yet, and I didn't feel like that would be useful. So what I did was go through some of our current and past portfolio and ask myself, what are the things that came up that were interesting from an evaluator or a project manager point of view that you could sort of get your head around conceptually without having to do multi-level modeling and open a software package that I barely know how to run? So I picked a couple of examples. I'm not going to pretend this is an exhaustive list, but we're going to talk about single interventions that get implemented across multiple sites, because that's a fairly common model that we see regularly. We're going to talk about multiple different interventions being implemented at multiple sites that may or may not share outcomes. We're going to talk about what I probably ill-advisedly call nested models, which we see come up in practical terms where we have big programs with multiple projects that are embedded in them. You'll recognize some of those examples. And then we're going to talk about this big, messy, multi-level theoretical relationships among levels and outcomes, looking a lot like that graphic that Lou shared with the consecutive, concentric kinds of circular things, and the implications of all of that. And spoiler, I think that's where the Includes program lives. So that's where we're headed. All right, let's talk about model number one. I can use my little laser pointer here, little cat toy. So first, quick thing here. This is kind of a conventional logic modeling way of thinking about this stuff, where we've got some intervention, And theoretically, we expect that that's going to result in an outcome. And theoretically, we think that if that outcome happens, then each of these subsequent outcomes will follow along in turn, right? So intervention, outcome, outcome, outcome. Over here, we've got our site structure. So the most basic version of this, and the easiest, although it does bring with it some challenges, is the situation where you've got a single intervention that's being implemented at multiple sites. So in our life, this very often looks like a school district that has appropriated, purchased, had thrust upon them some intervention, some program or other innovation, and they're implementing it district-wide. The sites become the individual schools. So it may be a reading program in every elementary school in the district. But as a first principle, everyone theoretically is running the same package. So working backwards, you've got some measures of some ultimate outcome over here. Prior to that, you expect there will be an intermediate. This is going to sound familiar, right, from the logic modeling structures. Immediate, intermediate, ultimate outcomes kind of orientation. I see some nodding. That's good. So in a situation like this, the entity, the bigger entity, can say, hey, all you sites, you're all working for the same outcomes. You're all going to use the same measures. And theoretically, you're all going to be implementing the same program, the same intervention. Now, as I said, this is not perfect because we run into challenges. I see some nodding out there. You all are, some of you experienced with this. We have some very common challenges, like the fact that the intervention doesn't get done the same way in every site. So you get buy-in, you don't get buy-in. You get resources, you don't get resources. I evaluated a program one time that lived in a school with another program, and the strategies that were supposed to be applied by the teachers were completely mutually exclusive. So they had a direct instruction, half-day kindergarten program where the teacher put the kids down and they all choral response, I am going to the store. And everybody said, I am going to the store. And then simultaneously they had a portfolio evaluation model that they had to implement that required that the kids produce stuff. Well, the curriculum they were required to use didn't produce stuff. So one of those things had to blow up, right? So that's a problem. We sometimes run into situations where, because of those sorts of things, the intervention is implemented differently, and the outcomes, you see differential outcomes site to site to site. So sometimes what folks want to do, they come to us and they just tell us what the program's doing. So essentially add up all of the sites and tell us is the program a success. We just want to know, are kids getting smarter because of this thing? But we can't answer that question if, in fact, there's differences between sites in measure 1. Because if measure 1 is supposed to cause measure 2, and measure 2, measure 3, you can't just look at measure 3. So there are some inherent challenges. Well, it just gets worse. Because we choose to make it harder on ourselves. This is, some of you will recognize this, if you've had anything to do with NSF EHR programs, iTest is a great example of this. In this kind of a model, we have multiple sites. In this case, they'd be grantees. We have this same logic model structure that there's some intervention and some expected set of outcomes. But what happens is the grantees write a proposal in response to an RFP that lists a number of outcomes. They're free to flex their logic, the theory of action of what they're doing, because over here they're all doing different interventions. So you've got different interventions that are all supposed to converge on an ultimate outcome or outcomes that are shared. But to complicate life a little bit further, you may or may not agree what the intermediate outcomes are as you sit down and talk about it. And in all likelihood, because NSF is nice about this, they give you all kinds of flexibility. These people are using measure this one to look at their intervention, and these folks are looking at a different measure because their intervention's a little bit different, but they're theoretically assessing the same outcome. So this gets complicated. I got to sit on a panel of folks working with the NSF through Stellar, asking the question, is the program making a difference? And they've been asking that question now for a long, long time, and they have a very hard time saying conclusively yes or no or how because of this kind of complexity. All right, but wait. It gets worse. Because, well, this isn't necessarily worse. This is a parallel way that things happen. This is the projects within a program kind of an orientation. The Department of Ed is pretty famous for this because they will send you an RFP and you'll write a proposal and you'll get a grant and you're working with a very specific outcome measure that may in fact be mandated by the legislation that empowers the program that you're working under. We call these GEPRAs, these reporting requirements. So they'll give you a measure, and they will give you sometimes a very specific measure. Sometimes it's a stupid measure. We evaluated a program, for those of you that know anything about statistics, you get to do the facepalm thing. The federal legislation said that every teacher that participates will show significant gain in their understanding of the outcome. Doesn't work that way. Because you cannot say a teacher has significantly improved his or her abilities. Those are measures of mean changes, among a group. And so the legislator said, we're going to hold their feet to the fire by giving them a measure that is impossible to report. And the folks providing the technical assistance came up with a spreadsheet to fake this all out. And we asked them at a conference one day, how does this work? And they said, we don't want to talk about it. Are there any other questions? So this is just a variation on that same theme. Different intermediate outcomes, different measures. They may or may not be implementing the same intervention, but theoretically over here is a fairly concrete measure everybody's aiming at. So that's just that's a little different take on the whole thing. So here's where life gets really special. And again, I'm going to propose that this is where we start talking about what's going on with includes. We've got a whole variety of sites and levels because there's no tight structure here that's necessarily inherited from the solicitation. We've got multiple kinds of interventions going on, and our outcomes structure, you'll see a little parallel here, but I took a picture of Lou's slide because in hindsight it would have been clever for me to use the same words. The intervention outcomes happen at different tiered levels that sort of exist in the ecosystem of where these programs are getting delivered. So we might have institutional outcomes that are being attended to by this intervention, but this intervention and this intervention aren't looking at that. These folks up here tell you if we can make those institutional changes, then these changes will happen at a program level and these changes will happen at the stakeholder level. But down here they're saying, well, our intervention acts directly on this thing over here. And yes, we agree that it should in fact contribute to that. But we also think that if you get this, then you'll also get this down here. And these folks over here are saying, no. So we got an intervention. I don't care about this. We got nothing to do with that. If we can get people to do this or understand this or know this, that in fact we can influence this measure over here, this outcome directly. So what happens when you start to ask questions about collectively, is this effort working? You go to your evaluator and they say, oh, build a logic model. We'll stick it up on the wall next to Byron's computer. And Byron will say, when someone calls again, wait a minute, which institution are you in and which intervention are you doing? Because what we get is multiple models that are kind of all layered on top of each other in very interesting and complicated ways. So that's that. Secondly, this research and development orientation. When I inherited my first NSF program evaluation, brand new PhD, I got a job, this is cool. I go and they say, here are the projects you're working on. One of them is this NSF project. And so I call the PI up, introduce myself, dig out the proposal, look at the scope of work. It's all cool. We're going to do focus groups. We're going to do questionnaires. It was a summer program to get kids into the STEM pipeline using robotics and programming of games. Sounds cool. We're going to do some observations of the teaching. We're going to interview all of the staff that's working on this thing. We're going to develop 3 outcome measures, one interest, an inventory kind of measure, one skills and understandings measure for these summer activities, one, do you want to be a scientist instrument, and they had all this described. And then I got to the budget. And we couldn't afford to do a third of the stuff that was on that list. So this is what I call the NSF conundrum. And this was, again, 14, 15 years ago, so things have changed substantially. But at this point in time, the external evaluator very often inherited the whole alphabet soup of the stuff that you might collect data for. The PI that I was working with, she was a great, very smart lady. But she was like, I'm just going to be running the program, you figure out how to collect all this data. And NSF thought they were paying her to be an investigator, right? To do research into her intervention. So in this kind of a model, the external evaluators inherited a lot of this. And the net result, frankly, was that in a lot of cases, the evaluation and research were both compromised because they were both under-resourced. So one response to that, how many of you are familiar with the common guidelines for education, research, and development? If you don't have your hands up right now, you have homework. Go find this document and understand the high-level application of this tool. So picture this. The fact that the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Ed came together and came to consensus around a conceptual model, a framework to manage research and development of innovations in education settings. If you don't appreciate how amazing that is, as for no other reason, go look at this document just because it represents a true breakthrough of how these systems can work. Talk about alliances, right? But some important things about the common guidelines. Number one, they emphasize this point that we're looking at models and not at instances of programs. So the something has got to be attending to the question of, does this model work with implications that it might do something else and go somewhere else and scale up potentially, as opposed to, are these kids at this site learning these things that they're supposed to learn? So it's a very different orientation. And also, the other thing that the common guidelines do that's very important is they push this idea that we should be collectively learning something about teaching and learning from these R&D projects. So it isn't just about evaluating whether the model's working. It's what do we learn about the bigger world from that model and its evolution and its design. So in a nutshell, the research and development common guidelines model says there's 6 types. It's a typology. I hesitate to put them like this because it makes foundational research look like it's less important than scale-up research because top is better, but that's not necessarily the case at all. The differences here is that from foundational through early stage exploratory design and development research, and then this is all impact testing, where you have to do actual inferential tests to see whether or not the thing did make a difference. Efficacy, effectiveness, and scale-up being 3 different iterations of that. They're all about the maturity of the innovation, and I'll use that word very purposefully. The thing being tested and developed. Down here, it's just a sparkly idea in someone's head. Up here, it's something that's demonstrated substantial effectiveness in broad-scale deployment in lots of different sites with different kind of people out in the real world, so it can survive. Now, the best thing that the Common Guidelines does for us is it puts all of these in play under the word research. Because we got those of you that survived the early days of No Child Left Behind and the What Works Clearinghouse and the Gold Standard, you got told, nothing you're doing is worthwhile unless it's a randomized controlled trial. And we're like, that doesn't work. They go, okay, all right, well, we'll give you a really high quality quasi-experimental, but you got to use one of these 2 analyses. Yeah, great. So now I got a 1 in 1,000 chance rather than a 1 in 1,000,000 chance of finding a setting to do one of these things. But what this does is it says, no, this down here is research. It matters. And it says, and this is where I get upset people when I say this, doing an RCT on an underdeveloped, immature innovation is just as stupid as going on television and saying, we proved this works by doing a case study in 3 schools. Okay? So it gives us power. Again, two purposes. Iteratively improve the innovation's design, and so it's promise for impact, and this second thing, to advance collective understandings. Hey, NSF, look what those things are. NSF, broader impacts. The ultimate value of the innovation being developed, potentially to help society. That's what we're all about in the big, big picture. And the other merit criteria, for those of you that are writing your proposal, that intellectual merit, the contribution to our collective understandings about what works. So the common guidelines came along, and we use them all the time. They get invoked by some solicitations, but we try and use it as an orienting framework for all of our studies of things that people are developing and testing. It just helps to get us all on the same page. Now, sometimes we change the language because the RFP uses different words. Department of Ed has these things they call developmental research, which require large-scale quasi-experimental tests. They're not developmental, but we're okay with that because we know that what they're really asking for is an effectiveness trial, and we know how to do that because it's described in the common guidelines. So one of the things that this orientation does for us is give us a wedge to clarify a really difficult challenge. What is the difference between research and evaluation? Well, it depends how you're talking about it. If you're talking to IRB, it's one thing. If you're talking to people that don't like research, it's another thing. If you're talking to people that can't say the word research without saying research. You know what I'm saying, right? Because you go and you talk to someone at a conference and they go, well, research says that. It's like, okay, I gotcha. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to propose a way to think about this distinction. That is useful to this question and bears potentially, again, on what we're doing with these Includes project. So I'm not redefining the words evaluation and research. I'm adding some additional words to clarify one distinction that you might make when you're talking about this business. The common guidelines let me call this research and development, to remind us that it's about developing an innovation from a sparkly idea to something with demonstrated efficacy that potentially can scale up to the greater world. And what I do over here is I call this program evaluation. And I do a little dance and I say, for the purposes of our conversation today, this thing over here is a structured study of the innovation that's being developed. The evaluand, the program, the technology, the whatever the heck it is that somebody is trying to make better and demonstrate if or how or for whom it works. This thing over here, this is the study of the implementation and results of these activities. So it's a meaningful, if perhaps somewhat arbitrary, distinction between two different functions. And the question is, what are you studying? There's two different roles here. They're both about gathering data, analyzing data, reporting data for purposes. But the question is, for what purpose? And what are you looking at? Typically, in an ideal world, the research and development piece of this puzzle has got to be firmly baked into, embedded in the work that's being done. The development, the research and the development have got to be hand in glove. Because very often it's trying to inform the improvement of the innovation. Over here, culturally and organizationally, we kind of expect that external evaluators are external. That you bring some perspective on it and say, I'm not in the thing, I'm looking at the thing, and you all are doing a pretty good job of the research, and your developers are smart, but you're not talking. So your feedback loop between the R and the D is not working the way it ought to work. Okay? Boop. So, how does this look methodologically? Here's our 6 levels. Boop. And these things, I'm not going to belabor this. We can talk more about this if you have questions we get to it. But this is about different kinds of studies for different purposes. Foundational research is about, let's go look at these variables and see how they relate. We think that student engagement is influenced by this and this, but what if it's engaged by this other thing over here? So you do some observations, you get some basic data, and then you start to build a hypothesis. You explore that hypothesis with some additional testing. You start to develop a thing that counts on that theory. And then eventually you put it out in the world and you start testing it. Now over here, we've got some evaluation orientations, program evaluation orientations. We've got sort of an implementation and results kind of a way of thinking about things. I like the word results because if I use the word impact, it means a very special thing on this side of the line because the impact requires that you're actually doing a statistical test. If you get pedantic, which occasionally I do. Process product kind of orientation. So you've got deliverables. Are your deliverables of quality? Yes or no? To what extent? Are the processes you're using to generate those outputs, are they of quality? Yes or no? Are you on time? Are you within budget? Right? So we can help you figure out how to do that. I get to occasionally use the word monitoring because sometimes that's an important function. Sometimes grantors want to know whether you're on track, and that's a legitimate and perfectly reasonable use of program evaluation findings. We talk about performance reporting because at some point or another, someone's going to ask the PI, the grantee, the people over here doing this, for some kind of evidence that they did in fact fulfill their obligation of their grant. And that's where sometimes that external program evaluation comes from. And very importantly, and this gets weird, so bear with me, formative feedback. But it's formative feedback on the R&D processes that very often might be doing developmental evaluation or formative evaluation, if you will, of the thing, of the innovation. So again, we're looking at two different things. All right, last big piece of this. So what does this mean if I sort of like pick and choose from these first couple of topics and talk about them in the context of includes? Well, again, it's early days. So I'm proposing some things that we want to look for and pay attention to, and I might be wrong, but some things to think about. Number one, my wife, who also is in the same business, she's a very good proposal writer. And when people ask her, how do you write good proposals? She says, follow the damn directions. And she is a direction follower. So, in the spirit of follow the damn directions, let's talk about some definitions from the includes solicitations, just so that we have a little bit of consensus around some of these terms. Broader impacts, I mentioned that earlier. These are the societal goals that ultimately will accrue from the work that's being funded. Here's where my life always gets crazy talking to clients. It's goals, objectives, outcomes, this, that, the other dang thing. In the context of includes, goal is the ultimate aim of the proposed project in a fairly big statement. And again, I'm just taking the NSF's solicitations language at face value and accepting that that's what they mean. And the goal of the program is to impact this business of representation of traditionally underrepresented populations in STEM at a national level. Okay? Objectives, these tend to be the things that are measurable, that are attached to the activities that are being proposed. The language that NSF uses in this solicitation suggests that they can apply both to activities and outcomes. So you might have an objective to say, we're going to develop this and implement that, so things you're going to do with the NSF's dollars, and outcomes, things that are on the other side of that line that you can't buy, that as a result, institutions will, left to their devices, do X, Y, or Z. Or programs will show this, that, or the other attribute. Or learners will X, Y, or Z. Okay? Outcomes, and thank you, NSF, for not making these two things too mushed up. Outcomes typically are framed as the latter, those lasting results for stakeholders, something that's persistent. Money ends. Does something stick? Knowledge, skills, understandings for individuals, groups of individuals, or perhaps institutions. All right? A couple more. Strategies. These are the high-level statements of what the money is being spent on. We're going to do this. Now, make no mistake, includes is a strategically oriented thing. And that imposes some challenges we'll talk about here in a second. Activities are the smaller pieces within those strategies. And outputs are the stuff, the deliverables, the products of those exercises, of those activities. The one that people get very hung up on every time I have this conversation with a new client. Output. Sometimes the output is just the completion of the activity. And so they do their logic model and they get all, I don't know what the output is. The output is you're done and you move on to the next step. How do I measure that? Check box. Is it done? Yes. All right. So let's look at some content out of the includes solicitation. This is not the first one, but this one that is going on right now. It throws the social innovation framework into the mix. And this is an interesting place because I don't know a lot about this. I've actually been doing some reading on this front. These social innovation frameworks, broadly speaking, they're models for developing or implementing solutions to social problems. And importantly, the value accrues to society. Aha! Broader impacts. Yay, I can see why NSF did this. There's various models. I went and looked at some. People are still writing books, so they take somebody's model and they add another thing and call it their model. But none of that's very helpful because NSF also says we've got this collective impact social innovation framework that is baked into the NSF's solicitation for the Includes program. I think this is very important because it sets a stage for some decision making that we're going to have to deal with here in a bit. Common agenda, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, shared measures, backbone organization. We evaluators get excited about this. Byron and his colleagues get excited about all of this. Right? But it all has to be there in some form, and we got to understand it. A couple more things to think about. Language from the solicitation. Meaningful assessment and evaluation of NSF-funded projects should be based on appropriate metrics, keeping in mind the likely correlation between the effect of broader impacts and the resources provided to implement projects. That's about scalability. A couple other things, those appropriate metrics in the context of this collective impact kind of approach, that's common measures. The implications of that are not to be underestimated. Another little bit here, the DDLP projects, design development launch projects. Launch pilot projects, demonstrate how extant teams and organizations can be reconfigured and joined together to form new alliances with common goals and purposes and collective impact style approaches with a strategy for how the effective practices of the alliance are likely to be deployed at scale. Wow, there's a lot going on there. Emphasis mine, by the way, on the bolding, but a few things. Common measures, because that's in play, is going to get to be a topic when we're talking about forming alliances. It's going to be a topic when we talk about how effective practices are. And that might be practices within the alliance, but that also might be instructional practices that are in an innovation that's getting developed by those alliances. Holy multi-level hell. We are going to be in it when we get into these things. Last but not least, all of this stuff has to talk about how these things might deploy to scale, which brings us full circle back to the common guidelines, whether stated or not. A couple more things. If the size of the activity is limited, evaluation of that activity in isolation is not likely to be meaningful. I might argue that in a big picture research and development kind of orientation. We might learn some very important things from very small sites, if those sites are particularly important in a way like, I don't know, the population that they do or don't represent. Right? So there's some stuff going on there. Evaluation, though, may be best done at higher, more aggregated levels than individual projects. So the implication of this, a couple of things. Again, use of common measures should allow us to attend to this across instances of an activity in multiple sites, if we're using the same tools to measure how well they're doing what they're doing and whether they're getting the results they expect. We also may or may not have opportunities to look at disaggregation at the site level, including some of those little special sites. I was a classroom teacher out in Washington State, and one of the things that I found very interesting is what they call out their remote and necessary schools. And there are places where, like, there's one that's on a little island in an Indian reservation out in Puget Sound, and the kids that go to the school, you know how they commute? Across the bay. And the school is on one island, and the kids live on multiple islands. They're within some distance, puttering across the bay in a little boat with a little outboard motor. They don't have buses. They don't even have a boat that everybody rides on. They all get their own little boats. So that's a very, very special population, and we've got to attend to those questions if we're really committed to this idea of inclusion, because that's where exclusion gets a toehold, is in those special cases. Quick question? Oh, use of common measures allows evaluation across instances of an activity. So it would help if it didn't have a typo in it. Instances, so you've got a particular activity that's being implemented across an alliance. In theory, we can use common measures to look at all of those things. So that should be thumbs up. But what comes with that is additional complexity, going back to some of those models we talked about earlier. So you got to attend to implementation, for example. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Yeah, sorry, that's a typo in addition to everything else. And then disaggregation at the site level is we say something about the activity and its evident implementation and effectiveness as a whole, but then how did it work here, how did it work here, how did it work here? Disaggregating the results by site, and maybe by population within a site. Yeah, sorry about that. My editor was, well, I didn't have an editor. And I'm on web TV admitting that I went out and... All right, so a couple more things and then we'll have Q&A. The proposals. You've got to describe agreed upon ways to measure and report success, common measures, but also you got to have consensus on what those common measures are measuring and how to implement them and stuff like that. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And you are likely going to include an external evaluator. Now, in this instance, I'm going to suggest that because a lot of what's been discussed are process-oriented things, like how your alliance comes together, how you're testing whether or not this thing works, how you're determining its potential for scale-up. Those are questions that are not about the innovation that that team of people is developing. Those are questions about the work that that team is doing. So that, I think, shifts the emphasis, and I would argue increases the importance of having an external evaluator that can come in and be a critical friend and look over your shoulder and say, yeah, this seems to be working. Maybe you need some improvement here. No, this is not working at all. Okay? It's that kind of orientation. I might be wrong, again. All right. I think this is the last one of these. Include a description of an evaluation plan that uses benchmarks, indicators, logic models, roadmaps, or other evaluative methods to document progress toward goals, objectives, and outcomes defined in the proposal. Really super important. The risk you run when you are primarily thinking about what you're going to do with these process-heavy, coalition-building kinds of projects, the risk you run is that the logic model stops being, I'll try and do this right the first time, stops being what it should be, which is a model, a description of the theoretical relationships between things that you do or things that the intervention does and ultimate outcomes for someone. So cause and effect, again, ill-advisedly, but cause and effect of elements of a program and outcomes for populations. Sometimes the logic model with these big hairy things turns into a plan of work. So we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and the outputs are going to be this and this and this. But the problem is because you are well removed from ultimate outcomes for learners, it's hard to remember that that's where your logic model has to eventually go. We could talk for a long time about this, but I just want to as you go into these things, you sit down to a logic model. I advocate for a backward mapping approach, right? Where you start with your ultimate aim. What's the ultimate aim of this program? Hey, NSF people, make a note. They don't know what is the ultimate aim of the includes program. Yeah. So that's over on the right end of your logic model. And you've got to figure out all of the interim steps by which the activities you're proposing to NSF are going to make that happen. Now, you may not get to 2/3 of them, but that's okay. You still got to know what they are. All right. Sorry, all right, you're all off probation. You can. So, how does this look in this paradigm of research and development versus program evaluation? Here's where I think these are some practical things you can take away with you. Number one, in the R&D column, studying bold, innovative ways for solving, broadening participation challenges in STEM. That's a research component. That you're studying that to see whether or not, in fact, your innovative ways actually solve this challenge. Models or prototypes. Words are straight out of the solicitation. You're developing things that ought to be transferable. It's not a model if it only works in Peoria. Not to pick on Peoria. Anyone here from Peoria? Good. Occasionally I say something like that and I get stink eye from somebody out of the audience. So, testing effective practices in terms of making underrepresented populations better prepared and ultimately more successful in STEM. Strategies for seeking and developing STEM talent. So these are the things that the development team is researching to improve and test and inform the rest of the world about their successes and what we've learned. Over here, these are the activities that the external program evaluation is going to attend to as a separate set of functions, using different data typically and done by different people. Synthesis activities. Are you doing synthesis activities? Are you actually engaging people across institutions? Are you actually looking across multiple levels? Byron's example of community college students getting an opportunity to engage in activities that they wouldn't have had a chance to absent that alliance. Are you building a research base? So are you contributing intellectual merit to NSF's portfolio? Are you spreading and adapting those effective practices, whatever they are? Are you supporting your partnerships in order to develop those strategies? If you don't, in your proposal, put some kind of resources toward managing the relationship's probably not going to work. And this is not just, 2 people with a couple of kids. This is 19 institutions. So it's going to require some effort there. A couple more things over here in the R&D side. Innovations developed by a collective impact approach. There's that word, innovations. I love that word. And importantly, all of this is done through this R&D lens. And I'm going to suggest that if you go and open your common guidelines for the very first time, go read the parts on design and development research. Type 3. That's where the bulk of this stuff, I think, probably lives. And it's a great place to be because there's a lot of cool opportunities for innovation there. And you aren't hemmed in by expectations of an RCT. Meanwhile, your program evaluator is going to be looking at your common agenda. Look, collective impact stuff. Do you have a common agenda? How did you develop a common agenda? Was there consensus around the common agenda? What process did you use to gain that consensus? How do your mutually reinforcing activities actually mutually reinforce one another? How do they hook together? Do you have shared measures? Are you developing them? Again, do you have consensus on the definitions of these things? I get a phone call once every 2 weeks where someone wants to measure engagement. And I say, well, what's engagement? Well, engagement. I got 9 definitions for engagement that we've used in different projects over the years. So you got to know what it is you're talking about. The nature and quality of your communication. Do you have a communication plan? Do you use a communication plan? Is it effective? And the processes and qualities of collaboration. This is going to be super interesting when we start talking about having a backbone institution. All right. Here's Kirk's extemporaneous of things that I think might matter. Number one, as I mentioned, includes, I think, is an example of the most complex kind of multi-site, multi-level evaluation that we'll ever do. So we just got to deal with that. Development of common measures. Development of common measures, as I said, requires consensus on the definition of the outcomes of the things that those measures are supposed to be testing. That is easier said than done. Implementation of quality and fidelity is going to be really, really, really important. And the reality is that that's also very expensive to do. And it's also easy to neglect. We want to jump to the end and find out, did it make a difference? But unless you can tell me that that thing was being implemented the same way and the way it was intended across the sites that you tested, in your alliances or the programs within those alliances, it doesn't matter what your outcome measures say. You got no case making a legitimate claim that it worked. Other practical considerations. Evaluation of all of these complicated things, collaboration, communication, et cetera, you got to look at quality. You can't just count the number of people that were in a meeting. You've got to understand if the meeting was productive. And coming to consensus as to how to define that is difficult. And again, it is not cheap. And it is not cheap to evaluate. Consensus regarding measures of quality are harder to develop than some of those other common measures. So you could agree we all think that the outcome is this, and we can measure that with a shelf instrument. But when we start talking about quality, it gets much fuzzier and much harder to pin down. A couple of thoughts about the potential for scaling. NSF is not explicit about what is supposed to be scaled. This goes back to my first introductory statements about, I was asked to talk about this, and I went, okay, great, scale up. And it's like, ooh, wait a minute. It may not be that simple. So there are opportunities here to scale up the innovations. There are also opportunities, kind of a weird meta-level thing going on, to scale up the efforts that are supposed to result in those initiatives. So that's going to require unpacking. The good news is I think scale up for NSF's purposes, can be addressed in both of those regards at this point in time. That may change as the program evolves. Theory-based evaluation design includes theories of action. The logic model, as I said, they're going to be huge because you've got multi levels. You're going to have multi outcomes associated with those levels. Each of those ovals is going to have a different thing assigned to it. The actual outcome, broadened participation, is quite some distance off in the future, so it's going to require some diligence to pay attention to and stick with it in order to get there and be able to measure it. Opportunities for what I call mutation of these innovations are very high in this kind of a setting, because this is a big picture catalyzing ideas kind of an approach. This is going to be a little contrary to my earlier comments about fidelity. But one of the things that's interesting is that occasionally an intervention, a thing, a technology, whatever it is, gets mutated at a site, but for a particular reason. So it may get mutated to accommodate a lack of a particular resource, or the presence of a particular external factor, an exogenous factor that bears on what's going on, or to better adapt to that particular ecology where it's being implemented in that particular instance. So this mutation can happen, and sometimes it's a good thing, which brought me full circle to something that I haven't thought of for a while I wanted to leave you with. And that is that the common guidelines talk to us about scaling up from this bright idea to something that works at scale, but they all presume that the innovation is going from unformed to very well defined and formed. But there's this cat named Chris Dede, and I don't know if any of you have ever dealt with Chris. Chris is kind of a lateral thinker. He argues that scaling up doesn't stop there. And if you put his model next to the common guidelines model, he talks about depth, which is about assessing the efficacy of the thing. He talks about sustainability. That's its ability to go out and be transplanted to new places where the conditions are maybe not optimal. He talks about spread, which is where the thing actually grows legs and starts to move out and be, I've forgotten now who wrote the book, the innovation book. Yeah, say it nice and loud. Yeah, thank you. So diffusion of innovation kind of an approach. But what Chris says is that there's also these other levels up here, shift and evolution. Shift is where someone takes that thing and goes, yeah, it works great, but I'm going to screw with it and make it do something a little different because it works better in our setting. So that's a fidelity issue, but it's a positive outcome. And evolution is where the thing goes completely berserk and evolves into a new life form out in the world. It actually becomes, it starts the process over. We start talking about a new innovation. All right. I used up a little more time than I wanted to, but I do have some time for questions.
Yes, well, thank you, Kirk, for that. So it was a great presentation on evaluation in general, and then the scale-up issue that I know is on a lot of your minds, so I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of questions. So we're scheduled for Kirk to take questions for about 10 more minutes, and then a discussion of all of the talks this morning after that until 12:15 when we have lunch. So we'll go ahead and start with Kirk's questions. So.
Or tell me I'm wrong, which is possible, as I said. Back at the back.
I have a question, and I'm not speaking for NSF. This is just me, Cynthia, an evaluator. When you're making the distinction between the R&D, the left-hand side, and the program evaluation on the right, you didn't talk much about who's doing things on both sides of that. Could you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you. I should have emphasized that a little bit more. Just so you've got the picture. Again, what's going on over here, this is studying the thing being developed, and that over there is studying the activities that are doing the R, the research, and the development. I think that there's a safe, it's sort of a cultural norm in this business that the work on that right side over there, the external program evaluation piece, generally should be external. So it should be someone that's not heavily invested in this. Now, it's not necessarily because we think that people over here can't understand whether they're doing things well. It's that, I think, a number of things. It's a more defensible position to say, well, these folks are not embedded in the work. They bring a little bit of a separate perspective on the work, on the efforts. Partially it's because sometimes these people over here don't know that their baby is ugly. And they need someone to tell them. Sometimes it's because these people are so busy doing it they don't have time or the inclination to step away and look at the doing. Practical things. You go to a planning meeting, all the people who are doing the planning are in the meeting. The person that's there observing the quality of the processes of that meeting can sit in the back and watch what's going on and not be involved. Now, importantly, so short answer is that program evaluation in this kind of a model, generally arm's length, someone separated from the actual R&D work. Now, a caveat there. I don't think this necessarily has to be somebody that doesn't know these people. We had somebody call and say, I need an external evaluator, and I need to put you in my proposal, but I know you're not supposed to talk to me very much about the proposal. I'm like, huh? I said, tell me more about that. Well, yeah, our last external evaluator said not to bother him because he wasn't supposed to get too friendly with the people that are running the project. And I'm like, all right, dude, you just got ripped off. Because that distance ought to be maintained by professional practice, by good quality, disciplined collection and analysis of data, not because you don't like or know or work with the people that are on that project team. So I very much encourage a collaborative kind of an orientation where everybody's pulling the same direction, but we've got to have the professional distance to be able to say, yeah, your baby's eyes are really close together. So, yeah, good question.
I think it's live. Okay, here we go. First of all, that was one of the best talks. I wish all NSF solicitations would go through you first before they hit the street. We would, our lives. So,
Bernice, I got a card right here.
Exactly. So,
sounds like a TA contract.
Dr. Cordova, she's pushing bold, not business as usual. But anybody who wrote an NSF includes, when you get back your reviews, those reviews are going to be very business as usual. So we're tap dancing to satisfy the reviewers.
Oh, I see.
So because there were some issues with the reviewers, I'll leave that alone. I'm a former NSF program officer, not that you need to know that, just to let you know. So here's my question, and I'm struggling with it, it's not a question. Exactly what is the scale that's going to go across the reviewers? What is this, the spread? That affects everything you said is like...
The panelists?
What's considered spread? How long are those legs? Should it be, bunny hops? Or, light year leaps? So that's not a question. So
okay.
That's where I'm going to struggle leaving this.
And I like how you prefaced it with exactly. So I've read panels I believe 4 different programs in NSF over the last 10 years or so. We work with about 100 proposers a year to various funders, and a majority of those right now are NSF. We've got proposals in right now under consideration, I believe, in 7 or 8 different programs. I'm listed as a co-PI on several of those and as PI on one of them. Every time I write a proposal as PI or co-PI and I get the report back from the panelists, I swear I'm never going to do it again. Because of this, because I think I got it figured out now. I know how to explain this. I know how to communicate this in a way that makes sense. And I'm always wrong. Now the reality is that there's no way to solve that problem. It's just that you've been there, you've seen it. The practical challenge is getting the people in an efficient way to read all of those proposals, do so in a repeatable, transparent, defendable, sensible way. We are always going to be dealing with that challenge because people bring all kinds of different stuff to the table every time one of those panels convenes. And every panel I've sat on has been a little dysfunctional in some regard, but every time I've left a panel, I've always been impressed with the diversity of ideas and expertise and perspectives that are involved. So, how do we get better at this collectively? I think we lean heavily on tools like the Common Guidelines. And we talk a lot about using consistent language. And we define our terms. When we sit down and have a conversation, we say, for the purposes of this conversation, what is an outcome? Because it matters how we use those words so we can have something closer to consensus understanding of these challenges. But I will agree with your premise sort of behind the question that because includes is really operating in a new space, because it is strategic, cross-cutting, multidisciplinary, systems building, coalition building kind of thing with this really long theory of action, I think there is a potential that we're going to spend a little bit more time fumbling around in the dark before we come to consensus on that. So collectively, everybody in the community, I guess, do what you can to play your part in that drama and work through those conversations and use those terms and try and be specific and recognize the complexity and the messiness of it. Because I don't think there's any other way we're going to get these. You don't get big results with very little specific kind of programming. You get big results with a big ask. And this is a big ask. So, respect the complexity. We're going to be battling the dragon for a while, but I think if we can make some inroads here, we'll actually make some differences that propagate out into bigger communities.
So on one of your first slides distinguishing the difference between research and development and program evaluation, you had 6 types of research that were informed by the Common Guidelines. And then on the right side, you had different types of evaluations. Can you, can you tell the difference or describe the difference between, formative feedback and the process product evaluation?
Yes. First of all, I'm a little kludgy here, a little bit imprecise about my definitions on the program evaluation because I didn't want to turn it into, because everybody that writes a book or article will come up with a different definition. So I try to pick some sort of common things. These aren't necessarily either-or propositions. Formative feedback, very specifically, is a purpose of evaluation, not a method, not an approach. Formative feedback is to provide information back to the team that's doing the R&D to help them do a better job with their R and with their D and with the integration of the R and the D. One of the ways to do that is to look both at the processes they're applying to both of those disciplines and to the integration, and to look at the quality and the timeliness of the products that they're producing. I kind of have a mental checklist I try and go through, and I always try and talk with the client about both process and product, because you can have great processes and still have a product that's problematic, and the findings there for formative feedback are going to be very different than if you've got a great product, but you arrive there through a really horrible process. And we do see all variations of that. Sometimes serendipitously they come up with an amazing answer, but it's like, you didn't do that on purpose. You probably are going to be able to do it again. So what are the implications of that? So they're two slightly different pieces of the puzzle. I apologize if I confused you with that. What else? Really good questions. I love your questions. Yeah.
Thank you for this. It's really helpful to unpack some of the complexity of all of this for someone like me who's new to thinking about this. My impression of the Includes pilot specifically was that it's about building the infrastructure. It's kind of like steps 1 through 3 of the R&D, more than getting to 4 through 6. And doing the program evaluation of 1 through 3 to figure out whether this is worth scaling to be big enough to even do an efficacy study. If that's sort of on base with what the pilot's going for, how do you really evaluate the research? Like, how do you evaluate the left side before you get to step 4?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good
Because you
question.
don't have students yet.
Right. So let me clarify. The question I'm answering is, how do you evaluate the research? Not how do you evaluate the thing that is being researched. Right. Each of these levels in the common guidelines comes with a stated set of purposes, stated set of outputs, what it's supposed to generate, and there's some guidance that crosses all of these levels about how you go about understanding whether this design and development project is a good design and development project. And the criteria are actually really nice. They're very elegantly stipulated in the Common Guidelines. Another thing the Common Guidelines gives you is a set of rationale. So the case that you need to make for design and development research says, we have preliminary evidence from some kind of foundational research that if we do this and this and this, that these things will happen. We are going to start to build a thing that leverages that theory to try and make learning happen. So that's a different case that you're pitching than for an effectiveness study that says, we've done small-scale pilots with inferential analysis of outcome measures, and we have some preliminary evidence that it appears it works. We need to understand if it works when the difference between efficacy and effectiveness is really important. Efficacy studies allow the developer to have his or her hands on the thing and it's like the plant in a greenhouse, so you can make sure it gets all the right water and it's in the right conditions, and so it's less likely to get bodged up in implementation. Efficacy or effectiveness studies put those things out in the world and test whether or not it'll survive out of the greenhouse. So
we should get to step 4 in the pilot.
I think that if the thing that you are piloting is an actual intervention that's supposed to have outcomes either for learners or kind of proximal to learners. So if you're only a couple, 3 steps away from students will get smarter faster and be more effective in the STEM pipeline, focusing on these targeted populations. If you're within sight of that, you can probably, at this design and development level, get to a place where you are, and it's in the title, piloting those things. But I don't know whether some of the includes projects that are currently being implemented as these pilots aren't in fact further this way in the logic model, and they're trying to do things that'll do that. Sorry, I don't know how else to say that. You might be working on a particular coalition building model. I don't know, I'm making this up. And the thing that you've proposed to NSF is still some distance from being pilotable like this. So the pilot is going to look different. And see, it's a great question because that's the kind of complexity we got to fight through and figure out how to make that work. And frankly, that's where some of my models are going to get press tested really badly, and some of them might get busted. But as I said, it's going to be interesting times. So yeah, thank you. Good question. All right, boss. One more?
I just want to ask you, because you have experience not just with NSF but with other agencies. Big picture. We're talking about NSF here because that's what most people are funded by. We're focused on includes. But we're talking about culture change and trying to inculcate evaluation into projects. What do you see beyond NSF? Is NSF leading the way and other people are following, or is NSF just doing its own thing? For example, I work for a professional society. Most of my members are funded by NIH. This doesn't really come across their radar at all. What do you see community-wide, society-wide?
I really am pleased with where NSF has gone in the last decade on this issue, largely because my introduction was, again, that NSF conundrum of, wait a minute, we're not doing good evaluation, we're not doing good research, we're paying people to, at one point, one of the first evaluations that I did in an NSF project, broader impacts was counting how many kids came to the camp. It's like, wow. It's neither an impact nor is it broad. But that's kind of the mode that we were in at that point. And remember, this is just anecdotal, this is just me. But I think collectively, and the Common Guidelines being a good example, and my conversation with folks at like EvaluateE, Stellar, InformalScience.org, the people that are working with the grantees, sort of that intermediary space between the grantees and the NSF, like we'd like to be at with this new thing you're going to get for us. I think that collectively they're doing really smart things by getting more precise about their expectations and the language, and all of the solicitations are at different places because they all are coming from different places. But I think collectively NSF is out ahead of the other federal agencies that we've dealt with in this regard. They are way ahead of we keep trying to branch out and do other things. So NIJ, the Institute of Justice. I don't know what they're looking for. The level of expertise that they provide in terms of guidance on what they expect for the evaluations is really, really awful. And the feedback we get from them is like they didn't even read it. Department of Ed just can't tear themselves out of the you've got to be doing RCTs kind of mode. So they still are making the mistake of not being very respectful of true developmental evaluation, design development research. What else? I just did a proposal for a grant, a proposer to the State Department for a democracy and justice building, the International Democracy and Justice Building Project, which I can't speak of because I'm officially on an NDA. But the ultimate outcome of their program is citizens of country X will rise up against the current regime. Cool. Theirs is, no, it's actually, careful. So, but they take, and they call it monitoring and evaluation, and they've gotten very formulaic. They've got a 10-column wide table that is your evaluation plan. And you've got to fill in every cell for every column, for every activity, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on. And it's all about, did you do exactly what you said you were going to do and measure it exactly the way you said you were going to measure it? So there isn't any pretense if there's any contribution to broader understandings of that. It's just about, accounting. So, short answer, I think NSF is doing a really, really good job. I think they're out ahead of the game. I think there still are challenges collectively that we're going to be dealing with. I think that the Includes program is an example of how that challenge can turn out really, really good, but we shouldn't underestimate what we're getting into.